wanted to say today, too, I wanted to say a special prayer request for Ken Nelson over in Mississippi. Talked to Debbie this morning, and she told me that he's in the hospital now. And just for those that know Ken and Debbie Nelson, they're long-time standing members in the Church of God, and he needs your prayers, certainly does. And pray that he will get better and get well in the next few days and weeks to come. Paul begins his second missionary journey, and if you'll remember, he took the very first missionary journey in about 47, I believe, or 45 A.D. Him and Barnabas were both ordained to go out and preach the gospel message, and they were sent out. They left Antioch there, close north of Jerusalem there, in the Middle Eastern area, and they took a ship and they went to the little island of Cyprus, and they walked, I guess, all the way across that island, which is a fairly good sized island, maybe 60 miles or so, and they preached along the way. And you'll remember some of the stories, how they met the guy that was devil possessed of a demon or whatever, and he cast him out, and he preached in all of those cities. And then he got on another ship and he went up and landed in Pamphylia, which is the southern part of Asia Minor there as it approaches the Mediterranean Sea. And from there he went, which was Perga, where he landed, and he went on up into Pamphylia and then up to Antioch in Pisidia. So he left Antioch and he arrives in Antioch. It's kind of like leaving Winona, Texas and going to Winona, Minnesota. They both have the same name, but they're completely different places. From there, he traveled overland to some of the locations you'll find familiar, like Iconium, where he was almost beaten. He went to Lystra, where he was beaten, and then to Derbe. And that was the end of his first missionary journey. It was short. And then he doubles back, and believe it or not, went back to those places where he'd almost got beaten and did get beaten. He backtracked all the way back to Antioch there in Palestine. And that was the end of his first missionary journey. It was short. He got to see all these people. Some 6 or 7 years later, we don't know exactly because the book of Acts doesn't give us very many dates to relate to, but we know about the time framing of the call of the Apostle Paul, and we know about what time that the Apostle Paul wrote the last of his letters, and that somewhere around 51, 52 A.D., 6 or 7 years later, Paul embarked on a second journey, and he writes of it in the 15th chapter of the book of Acts. We'll begin in verse 36. And some days after Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing." Let's go see how all these little fledgling church groups are doing. It's been 6 or 7 years. I'm sure he missed them. I'm sure he met some folks there that he loved desperately and would like to go back and see how all of them are doing. In verse 37, it says, "And Barnabas determined to take with him John, who was surnamed Mark." And you'll remember the occasion of John Mark, as he's called by the writers and the commentaries. "And Paul thought it not good to take him with him, who departed from them from Pamphylia and went not with them to do the work." So the first missionary journey they went, when they left Cyprus, where Barnabas was from, they took his cousin with him, which was John Mark, who was Barnabas' cousin. By the time they landed again there at Perga, John Mark decided something happened and there was a dispute, and he left and he went back to Jerusalem. Some of the commentators say, when you read the story of the book of Acts, when it first mentions Barnabas and Paul were sent, Barnabas' name is mentioned first. But somewhere along the way, we realize in Luke's writing that Paul became the more dominant one in that group, the leader, and they start mentioning Paul and Barnabas and Paul and the others. And some have speculated as to whether that was the reason John Mark got offended, because his cousin wasn't in charge anymore and Paul was, and now, things worked the same, and so he packed his bag and went back to Jerusalem. We know later on, let's finish this here. It says, "And Paul thought it not good to take him with it because he had departed, and there was a contention that was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other, and Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. So Paul said, I'm not taking this guy with me. He's not dependable. He won't show up when he's supposed to. He left us hanging, there where we are hundreds of miles away. And so these men were men, Paul and Barnabas and Silas and John Mark. And they don't always agree. They always have different emotions, different levels of understanding. They have tempers. They have human nature, I guess. But these men were called of God, and they were given the Holy Spirit. Certainly Paul and Barnabas were. It tells us that in the book of Acts. I think that this was mended later on. We read in the book of Colossians, it said Paul instructed the church there at Colossae to receive John Mark, if you'll remember that. And remember one time Paul wrote to Timothy, and he said, Luke only is with me, but bring Marcus, because he's profitable to me in the ministry of God, of Jesus Christ. And so that somehow I don't know whether John Mark became more mature over the years that came forward from that time up to 60, maybe 61 or 2 AD, that John Mark became more convicted and a better emotionally and spiritually mature person, but that certainly was healed up. Chapter 16, verse 1, it says, Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, there were certain disciples there named Timothy, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewish, and believed, but his father was a Greek. So here's the introduction to Timothy, the first time we ever hear his name, Timotheus, as he's later called. And we find out that he was the son of a Jewish, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of the brethren that were in Lystra and Iconium. So in the community, Timothy had a good name. I mean, he had a good reputation as a righteous man, a good man. Him would Paul have go with him, and took and circumcised him. Now remember, this is right after the Jerusalem conference in Jerusalem, where Paul went there, and they had this whole dispute. If you look back across the page in chapter 15 and verse 23, they received letters from James and the others at Jerusalem that they would go out and give this letter to those people and tell them, if you read that whole passage there about keeping God's laws, and that they were not to, down in verse 29 of the previous chapter, they shall abstain from meats offered to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. That was just the basic things they would tell the Gentiles. They wouldn't burden them with a circumcision, because it was a sign for the Israelitish nation. It was a national symbol for the nation of Israel, and it wasn't for the Gentile nations. But Paul here decides to circumcise Timothy. It's kind of unusual, isn't it? And you have to ask the question, why would he do that? I believe there's a couple of reasons. First off, he knew he was going to be encountering Jews in the Jewish synagogues. And he couldn't be bringing in a man whose father was a Gentile who was uncircumcised. So in order for things to go smoothly, I believe, Paul circumcised Timothy so that it wouldn't be a hindrance to him. I want to turn, if you would, hold your place here and go to 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, because I call this Paul's motto. 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, and verse 19. 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, and verse 19. For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself a servant of all, that I might gain the more. Someone asked me one time, what would you like to see on your tombstone? You ever played that game? What would you like people to say about you? Some of the comedians have had some really funny ones. It's like some of the comedians will have something on their tombstone, and then ... and there's nothing else. It leaves you kind of humorously looking at their tombstone, and you ought to look up some of them sometime. And under the Jews I became a Jew, listen to this, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, of course those were the people of national historical Israelites and Jewish people that had kept God's law down from the time of Moses, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without the law, the Gentiles, had never heard about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had no concept of God's laws, the Mount Sinai or the nation of Israel. Being not without the law to God, he says, not without the law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without the law. All the Gentile nations. To the weak became I as weak. Interesting language here. Paul, I think about the man Paul, who was called personally by the voice of Jesus Christ, and he says he's going to become weak instead of, well, I am Mr. Paul. Did you forget not who called me? You know, he didn't have that attitude. He says, I became weak to those that are weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. That's what I wanted on my tombstone. That's what I'd like to see on my tombstone. That by some means I might have saved some. That was my answer. So back here in the book of Acts, in the 16th chapter, he says, we'll pick this up a little bit down here in verse 4. He says, and they went through the cities, they delivered them the decree for to keep that were ordained of the apostles and elders which were at Jerusalem. We just read that. That was across the page over here in Acts 15th chapter. They were given letters that said, teach the people to do these things, and everything else they will learn in the Sabbath service. We talked about this last week. They'll learn about God's law. They will learn about salvation. They will learn about Jesus Christ. They will learn what all of the prophets had to say and how they foreshadowed Jesus Christ and spoke of him in their synagogues on the Sabbath service. And not only synagogues, but sometimes it was down by a river. Sometimes it was in people's homes. Sometimes there were just small gatherings of 4 or 5 or 6, or maybe just a family all by themselves. And so were the churches established in the faith and increased in the number daily. And I would imagine Paul, I would imagine he was enjoying getting to see these people again. See how the church groups did. Did they grow? Were they still there? Were more people coming along and listening to the church of God, listening to the gospel message? Verse 6, now when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia, and were forbidden of the Holy Spirit to preach the word to Asia. Interesting language. This trip, by the way, he didn't leave and go into the ocean to Cyprus and into the Mediterranean and then up into the northern part of the region there, close to Greece. They actually left and went by land up around the edge of the Mediterranean Sea to Paul's old hometown, Tarsus, and made their way across Asia Minor there, backwards now from the previous trip that he had made. And he started in Derbe and went to Lystra and then back to Iconium. Backwards is the order of the cities that you'll see. And he saw a vision in verse 9. It appeared in the night. There stood a man in Macedonia and prayed and said, come over to us in Macedonia and help us. Another interesting aspect of this journey. Paul has this vision in the middle of the night. A guy says, pray. So the whole party, while they're back there close to the shores around Ephesus, they go across the Aegean Sea to Philippi. Now, you know about Philippi. You read about the book of Philippians where Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians. This is the first time he comes to Philippi. Down in verse 11, therefore, loosing from Troas, we came straight course to Samothracia, and next day to Neapolis, and from thence to Philippi, which is the chief city of that part of Macedonia, and a colony. And we were in that city abiding certain days. And on the Sabbath day, now remember, like I said last week, this is 51, 52 A.D. You know, how long ago has it been since Jesus was died, buried, and resurrected? Here Paul is preaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. And out of the city by the riverside where prayer would want to be made, he sat down and spake unto the women. And he met this lady Lydia, which was a seller of purple. We know that. And her mind was opened almost immediately. She became converted. They baptized her. And she said, look, y'all don't need to be hanging out in the streets or trying to find a place. Please come into my home. I believe she probably may have been a widow lady, but she was of some substance because she was a seller of purple. And that was probably some exotic dye that was used in the making of clothing. And so she was probably okay. And she had the wherewithal and she had the resources to take care of this group. Down in verse 16, and this is where I really wanted to begin the story today and the purpose of the message. And the same day, and the same followed, verse 16, it came to pass, as we went to prayer, a certain damsel possessed of the spirit of divination met us, and we brought her, which brought her master much gain by soothsaying, and followed Paul and us, crying, saying, and this is Luke writing now, he's saying Paul and us, because Luke is with him, and he's recording these events, saying, these men are the servants of the Most High God, which show unto us the way of salvation. Here is a woman who is somehow possessed of a demon, and she recognizes that these are servants of the Most High God. Would send chills all the way back down my spine to my ankles if someone said that to me. Because I know that that would be of another world, of another spirit that recognizes that. And I don't know if this was said in hostility or in some sort of a smart aleck attitude or a, degrading way. And this she did many days, but Paul, being grieved, turned and said to the spirit, notice that, just like Jesus did, he didn't talk to the lady. He talked directly and addressed the evil spirit that was in her and said, I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. And he came out that same hour. And of course, the guy that was making all this money off her was extremely angry now. He had lost his living, he lost all the things, and he stirred up the Jews and the magistrates, and they said, he teaches customs which are not lawful to us, neither to observe, being Romans. And the multitude rose up together against him, and the magistrates rent off their clothes, so they stripped Paul and Barnabas and commanded to beat them. I've never been beaten like that. I hope I never do. But there are customs in the world nowadays where you can be caned, where they take a big reed or a cane or something like that, and will just actually whip you like a dog, or strip you and whip you with a whip or whatever. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. So they got them bound by hand and foot. They're not only in prison, they're in the inner part of the prison where they can't get out. They assuredly cannot escape in no way. Verse 25. I believe, I wrote here in my notes here in verse 11 through 25, these seem only to be, and this is my quote, only to be another in a long train of abuses against and toward the ministers and evangelists of God wherever they have gone, but the outcome would reveal its whole purpose. We'll see that in a minute. Verse 25, and at midnight Paul and Silas prayed and sang unto God, and the prisoners heard them. I can hear the prisoners. It's midnight. Shut these guys up. We're trying to sleep. And they're over there praying and singing and rejoicing. And they're in prison. They just got beaten. They're probably still licking their wounds, and the blood's dripping off their backs and their arms and legs. And they're praying and singing. In verse 26, and suddenly there was a great earthquake. I want to take a little bit of time out here and I want to read what I wrote. In the middle of the night, when everyone was asleep, when did God originally rescue the nation of Israel out of Egypt? At midnight, wasn't it? Remember, they had to have their clothes ready and their loins girded and their staff in their hand and their shoes on their feet. It was at midnight. And when Jesus, in the parable of the 10 virgins, said, behold, the bridegroom cometh, it was at midnight, wasn't it? And later he would say, watch you know not when your master comes, whether it be evening or at midnight. Here it was midnight. And these guys are saying, shut up. And then all of a sudden there's this great earthquake and the whole building is starting to shake. And I ask you the question, why an earthquake? Was there an earthquake because of Paul and Silas? Did God perform this earthquake so Paul and Silas could get out of prison? We read here in a little bit that they were destined to get out the next day. They were going to release them without incident. So why the earthquake? And why shake the foundations of this prison? When Jesus died, the Bible tells us there was a great earthquake. that there were actually men and women that came out of their tombs and walked back into the city. Remember the centurion that was standing there, and he saw the black darkness of midday or late in the evening there, and the earthquake shook, and it rent the temple and the veil in the temple in two, and he said, truly this was the Son of God. I mean, it was proof to him, wasn't it? In Matthew 24, it tells us that you'll see signs, you'll see earthquakes, and if you go to the book of Revelation in the sixth seal, it says there was a great earthquake right before the heavenly signs, this great earthquake, and it tells us that there was a part of the city, a tenth part of the city was destroyed, and the temple was open, and the building in heaven during this time of the seventh last plague, and the final trumpet blast goes out. It says that the temple of God was open in heaven, and there was lightning, voices, thundering, and an earthquake and great hail. Was it the result of Paul and Silas praying? Was that the result of the earthquake? Paul and Silas were praying, and God answered it. I believe, yeah, partly true, but I also believe that earthquakes are not, that earthquakes are common in that area, aren't they? And you could write it off, and so could the people in that prison say, well, that was just an earthquake. We have them here all the time, like we do out in California. But on this occasion, on this night, at midnight, these two guys were praying and singing, and there's an earthquake. I think all of them together created something in the heart of this man that we will see. The earthquake alone, with the testimony of Paul and Silas as they began to sing and pray, brought about conviction of those who had witnessed this event. So we go back to chapter 16 to verse 27. And the keeper of the prison, he's the head guy over the prison, awakening out of his sleep and seeing the prison doors open, he drew his sword and would have killed himself, supposing that the prisoners had fled. In Peter's occasion, you remember when Peter was thrown into prison on one occasion, it tells us that the angel went in there and woke him up. Peter was asleep. He was in prison. Herod had killed James, sought to kill Peter, got him, put him in prison, and was going to kill him the next day. Peter's asleep. I don't know about you. I don't know if I would be asleep or not. And an angel taps him on the shoulder, said, get up, get your clothes on, gird your loins, put your shoes, sandals on, gave him time to do all of that. His shackles fell off of him, and he walked out of the prison. And he knocked on the door at home, and the people didn't even believe it. They thought he was an apparition or something. He couldn't be him. Herod killed those guards because Peter had escaped. That's what they thought. Here, this guy said, I'm not going to be killed by Herod. I'm going to kill myself. And Paul cried with a loud voice, says, do yourself no harm, for we're all here. We're still in here. We haven't gone anywhere. And then he called for a light, and they sprang in and came trembling and fell down before Paul and Silas. The keeper of the prison, who was sound asleep. He was sound asleep at midnight. The prison doors get open. Do you suppose there any significance about that for him? Prison doors being open and shackles falling off people's arms. I like to think that years later, after this event occurred, that this keeper of the prison would think about this night and the significance of all these prison doors being open and realize God was telling me something here. And I didn't even know what he was trying to tell me. He would recall these events and understand more deeply the significance of what happened that night. Verse 28, and Paul cried with a loud voice, said, don't do yourself any harm. And he says, verse 30, and he brought them out and said, sir, what must I do to be saved? It's like day and night for this guy. An immediate response from this head warden, if you want to call him that, trembling, what must I do to be saved? I believe this is the question for many men and women over the course of centuries who witness things in their life that are unexplainable. Do you suppose that there's the possibility that God would consider me? And I would imagine this warden thought that too. do you suppose God has something in his plan of salvation that includes me? And I believe that he would find out somewhere down the road. And look what Paul's response was. And they spake unto him the word of the Lord, and to all that were in his house. Skip verse 31. And they said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved, and your house. So not only you, because you are converted, your whole house will be saved as well. And they spake unto him the words of the Lord to all that were in the house. I would like to imagine today what Paul said to them, and I want to quote a little bit of this here to you. They spake unto them the message of Jesus that Jesus gave. His words, they talked to him about his message, his example of his life, what he said, how he acted, how he treated people, what he taught, how he explained and answered questions that they had for the original apostles. I mean, if you had 15 or 20 minutes of somebody's time, which is hard to get anybody's attention anymore these days. I mean, the cell phones, the television, the radio, it's all a distraction. People will ask me questions from time to time, and I'll begin to answer, and I know I've got about 30 seconds, and their attention's out the window. It's a telephone call, and you get a commercial is all you get. That's all the time people will allow you. So in that short period of time, what would you say to someone who asks you, how can I be saved? You know, the name Jesus Christ hardly crosses the lips of most people. It just doesn't. We say a lot of words during the day, but to ever mention Jesus Christ, that's a long shot, isn't it? I believe that he would have told him very quickly, Jesus was a man come from God. He existed before the world began. As we read, I'm going to read here what it says. Well, I could probably just quote that to you. God, who at sundry times in diverse manner spoken to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. And he would go on to explain that, say Jesus was a man. He was here. We saw him. And he came from God. He had a pre-existent state. He was a part of the creating of all the things that we know and see, including this world and including you. And yet he came down to this earth, and he had a message from God of a good news, of a message of salvation, that things aren't always going to be like they are now. You're not always going to be under the Roman domination in your life. You're not going to be a prisoner or a soldier the rest of your life. God is calling you for a greater calling. He became human. He was born of a miraculous conception by being born of the virgin birth by Mary. He lived in and around Nazareth and eventually came to Jerusalem when he was about 30 years old. And he began to preach the good news of God. He came to reveal the Father and show us who God really is. God is not a Greek, Roman, or Egyptian God. Some of these weird hateful, angry gods that you know about. God is actually a loving, kind, generous, long-suffering God that is like your own Father. And he's even more so because he has great power and enormous mercy. And Jesus is his Son, and through him the whole world was created. I believe he would have told him that Jesus is the Son of Man. And what he said, Jesus on one occasion said he's come to save that which is lost. And he said on another occasion that they that be whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. He came to help people. And he healed all manner of people. He healed the sick. He healed the blind, the deaf, people that had leprosy, people that had demon possession. Even we were given those gifts. And I healed a man or a lady, here recently, and one on the island of Cyprus. And he even raised someone from the dead. Can you believe that? And I would believe the guy would have been overwhelmed by hearing that. I like to think Paul says to him, you should have read what he said on the Sermon on the Mount. I wasn't there, but I read it. And how he talked about the way that we should live. That we're to have love for our enemies, that we're to be compassionate, merciful, long-suffering, and above all, forgiving one another. That's the lesson that he would have told him. He spoke of faith, how we're to have faith of a grain of mustard seed in God, that someday we will have salvation. And then he would have talked to him eventually, I guess, about baptism, how Paul himself wrote in the book of Romans that, baptism is an outward symbol of an inward change in the heart of man. And I believe this message struck home with this warden here, this keeper of the prison. Jesus also laid hands on people. He laid hands on the children. He laid hands on the lady that was stooped over. When he healed somebody, he laid hands on them. He was not afraid to touch people and lay his hands on them, but he also set the example of setting aside someone or ordaining someone, as he did the apostles. And as the apostles would go on to do, remember when they chose the 7 and they said, we don't need to serve tables. So they laid hands on those 7 men, one of whom became Stephen, who was a very powerful preacher and gave a testimony that cost him his life. And how Paul even said, I laid hands on Timothy and ordained him to be an evangelist and a minister. So through the laying on of hands, you receive God's Holy Spirit and you shall be saved. Jesus also spoke of the resurrection. I want to mention this just briefly because he would have told the man, I know that you have all these ideas about life after death, because so did the Egyptians, so did the Romans, so did the Greeks, so did the Assyrians. But Jesus said, this is an evil and adulterous generation, and they seeketh after a sign. But no sign shall be given save the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. He spoke of the resurrection, the power that God has over death, and that Jesus himself died. Now, most people don't believe that, but Revelation tells us when Jesus is speaking in the first chapter of the book of Revelation, he says, I am he that is alive and was dead. And God's power raised him up, setting us a path, an example that will happen exactly to us the same way. And that's why the Apostle Paul wrote so meticulously 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter, where we talk about the resurrection chapter. And finally, Jesus spoke of the judgment of God, that all the evil and the evil practices of men and the wickedness of this world are going to be overcome, including Satan, the devil himself, who is the author of all of this wickedness. It is interesting, as I said, when Peter was cast into prison under Herod, for that he was asleep. And on this occasion, Paul and Silas are singing and praying to God. And neither of these men were controlled by their circumstances. And Paul actually, if you read the rest of the story here, the jailer was about to let him out. Paul decided, I'm going to stay in jail. He didn't go out. He said, they arrested me out in the open, condemned me, and cast me into prison in the open, being a Roman, and beat me being a Roman. They heard he was a Roman citizen. They were scared to death, because you don't beat a Roman without going to trial first and getting witnesses. So they were in trouble. And he made that magistrate come down there personally and get him out of jail and send him on his way. And that's exactly what happened. I love that. I love that Paul had the intuition to think that far ahead in the faith of that. I don't know what your circumstances are, nor do I know, or maybe you don't even know the events that led up to the gospel being preached to you. I wonder what situations were in the hands of God that were guided by his power, the sufferings at times of people that went before you, the trials that others had to suffer, the stripes, yes, even incarceration in prison. Being indicted is no stumbling block for God. Being arrested is no hindrance to him. Being in prison is not even an obstacle for him. You know, we don't even know this keeper of the prison's name. It's a beautiful story, and we don't even know his name. Nor do we know how many members of his family were baptized here, because it tells us that all of his family were baptized as well. They were all converted. However, we do know that on this night, when suddenly awakened out of his sleep, at midnight, and finding himself at the feet of an unsuspecting prisoner, the gospel was preached unto him. And the message, well, it found its target right into the heart of the keeper of the prison, and he was saved. I wonder what it will take, what circumstances it will take for you to be saved.